They called it the witch's hut, not because anyone could prove a witch had lived there, but because nobody in Greystone Hollow would claim it, and in small towns. That was reason enough for the stories to start. It sat 2 miles into the forest, down a deer trail so overgrown you wouldn't find it unless you already knew it was there. The roof sagged under the weight of rotting shingles, and the windows were black. Not broken, but black, as though they'd been painted over from the inside. Some said it was a hunter's cabin from the 1800s. Others said it was built by a trapper, who went mad and nailed animal bones to the rafters. What everyone agreed on, however, was that strange things happened to people who went inside, and not all of them came out again. Eli Winters had heard the stories his whole life, but tonight, he wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for his dog. Daisy had bolted into the woods after a rabbit an hour ago, and he'd been calling her ever since. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to close around him. Branches snagged at his jacket. The moonlight barely made it past the canopy, and the air smelled damp, heavy, like soil turned after a grave had been dug. Every step on the narrow path was muffled by wet leaves. Then he saw it, at first just a sharp roofline through the trees. Then the outline of walls, crooked and bowed inward, like the forest had been pressing against them for decades. Eli froze, because the stories about the hut came back all at once, and because Daisy was barking from somewhere inside. The front door hung slightly ajar, shifting in the wind with a soft creak. No light came from within, yet he felt the weight of the dark interior pressing out toward him like a cold breath. He tried calling Daisy again, but his voice sounded smaller here, as though the trees swallowed it. He stepped closer. That's when he noticed the carvings. Not initials, not symbols he recognized, but long, looping gouges running up and down the wood, as if someone had traced a shape over and over until the blade bit deep. In the spaces between the grooves, the wood was stained darker, almost black. The smell hit him next. Not rot exactly, but oldness, a closed-up, airless scent, mixed with something faintly sweet. He pushed the door further and stepped inside. The first thing he saw was the table. It was small, meant for one person, but cluttered with things that looked stolen from 100 different lives. A silver locket, a child's shoe, a rusted pocket knife, a jar half full of teeth that might have been human. Beside it, an oil lamp, still warm to the touch. The walls were hung with bundles of dried plants, some tied with red string, others left to twist into strange shapes. In one corner sat a chair, its seat worn smooth, but the floorboards beneath it were covered in deep scratches, as though the chair had been dragged there over and over again. Daisy wind from somewhere deeper inside. Eli hesitated at the threshold. The hut was no bigger than his father's old fishing shed, but the air inside felt heavier, thicker, as if he'd stepped into the belly of something living. His eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the details. The walls weren't made of logs, as he'd assumed from outside. They were lined with rough planks, each carved with deep grooves and spirals. Not neat work, not decorative, more like someone had hacked at them compulsively. The wood was splintered in places, and he could see a darker, sticky residue lodged deep in the cuts. The table in the center was worse up close. The jar of teeth wasn't just filled, it was arranged. The smaller ones at the top, like milk teeth from a child. Larger molars and canines at the bottom, stained in a way that made his throat tighten. He tried not to look at the locket beside it, but his eyes kept being pulled back. Inside was a tiny photograph of a little boy, no older than 5, his mouth open in a frozen laugh, missing one of his front teeth. A low huff came from deeper in the hut. "Daisy, hang on, girl," Eli whispered, his voice too loud in the oppressive quiet. The oil lamp by the table was still warm. That, more than the teeth, more than the carvings, made the hair on his arms lift. Someone had been here recently. Someone could still be here. He forced himself forward, past the table, toward a narrow hallway that seemed far too long for the size of the building. The floorboards creaked with every step, but the sound didn't carry. It felt smothered. There was a smell here, stronger now, herbs rot, and something metallic. The first doorway led into what might once have been a bedroom. A low cot sat against the wall, its mattress sunken in the middle. Above it hung dozens of bundles of dried plants. Some were familiar, rosemary, sage, but others had dark, leathery leaves and curled seed pods he didn't recognize. They dangled on red string, twisting slightly as if stirred by breath. Against the far wall was a wardrobe. It stood open, but not empty. Inside were coats, heavy, woolen, water-stained. They didn't look like they belonged to the same person. Different sizes, different styles. A man's leather jacket hung beside a child's yellow raincoat, its sleeve torn at the cuff. Eli backed away, his chest tight. The air felt warmer here, almost humid, though the door behind him was still open to the cold night. Daisy barked again, sharper this time. It came from the end of the hallway. The next room was darker. He had to step inside before he could make out the shapes. Shelves against every wall, stacked with jars. Some held murky liquid with lumps suspended inside. Others were stuffed with feathers, hair, or folded scraps of paper too damp to read. A single jar contained something that looked like a bird's wing, but it was pale, the feathers more like thin skin. The far corner of the room had no shelves, just a trapdoor. It sat flush with the floor, a metal ring for a handle. Daisy barked. Again, and this time, the sound came from beneath him. Eli's first instinct was to pull her out. Whatever was down there, he'd get her and be gone before whoever lived here came back. He crouched, gripped the ring, and heaved. The trapdoor moved, but only a few inches before something caught. A chain, he swore under his breath, and tugged. Harder, but it only rattled against whatever lock was keeping it shut. "Daisy," he called. The bark came again, but it sounded different now, muffled, distorted, like it had to pass through layers of fabric or earth. He pressed his ear to the wood. There was another sound beneath the barks, a slow, wet drip. He straightened quickly. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't right, that maybe this wasn't even Daisy. A movement in the doorway caught his eye, a shadow pulling away from the frame as though something had been leaning in, watching him. He spun around, but the hall was empty. The smell hit him a second later, smoke. Not wood smoke, but something sharper, chemical, as if someone had lit the wrong kind of fire. He moved toward the front room, but stopped dead when he saw the door. It was closed. He had left it open. He was sure something scraped across the porch. Boards outside, slow, deliberate, not quite footsteps, more like something heavy being dragged. Eli's breath came shallow now. He edged toward the door, hand out, and nudged it open. The forest was waiting. That was the only way he could describe it. The mist was thicker, curling low to the ground. The trees seemed closer together than before, their trunks crowding toward the hut, and in the nearest branches, hanging like ornaments, were small shapes swaying in the wind, teeth tied on strings. Hundreds of them, Behind him, the trapdoor thudded once, hard. The thud from the trapdoor wasn't an accident. It had weight, timing like a knock from something that knew exactly where he was. Eli stared at the wood, half expecting to hear it again. Instead, the silence pressed in thicker than before, so complete he could hear the rasp of his own breath. He didn't want to open it. Every part of him screamed to walk away, push through the door, and run until the forest let him go. But Daisy barked again from below, and that cut through the fear like a hook through flesh. He went to the table, scanning for anything that could break the lock. His eyes landed on the rusted pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He flicked it open, pried at the chain through the crack in the floor, and felt it give just enough for him to wedge his fingers and dot the chain clinked to the side. The trapdoor lifted. A smell poured out wet soil, mildew and something else, something sweet and rotten that seemed to cling to his tongue. The opening yawned into darkness. A wooden ladder dropped into it, the rungs slick with moisture. He couldn't see the bottom. Daisy. His voice barely made it past his lips. A whimper answered from below, faint, weak. He shoved the knife into his pocket and began to climb down. The wood groaned under his weight. Water dripped somewhere beneath, the sound echoing in a space that felt larger than the hut above. 10 rungs down, his boots met stone. The air was colder here, so cold his breath puffed pale in the dark. He took out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam carved through the dark, revealing rough walls, not just a basement, but a tunnel cut straight into the earth and shored up with rotting timbers. The ground was damp, a thin layer of mud sucking at his boots. The tunnel stretched away into blackness. Every few feet, the walls bulged inward, the packed earth scored with deep claw marks. He crouched to look closer. The marks weren't just gouges. They formed shapes, symbols, the same looping curves he'd seen carved into the hut's walls above. Daisy barked again, louder now, from somewhere ahead. Eli moved forward, his light catching glints of metal on the ground. He bent to pick one, up and froze. It was a key, small, brass, bent at the teeth. It was still warm. He pocketed it and kept moving. The tunnel began to slope downward, the air growing wetter, heavier. He passed shelves set into the walls, planks balanced on wooden pegs. Each shelf held jars, just like upstairs, but the contents here were worse. Preserved animal parts floated in amber liquid, but some weren't animals at all. He saw a tiny, shriveled hand, a pair of eyes, cloudy and pale, pressed against the glass like they were watching him leave. The barking grew frantic now, echoing around the bends of the tunnel. He rounded a corner and stopped. The passage opened into a chamber. The ceiling was low, the walls slick with moisture. In the center stood a wooden cage, its door hanging open. Inside, a blanket lay crumpled in a heap, and beside it, a shallow dish of water. The blanket shifted. "Daisy," he whispered, rushing forward. She lifted her head, but it was wrong. Her eyes reflected the light in a way he'd never seen before, like glass catching a flame. She whimpered, tail tucked, and scrambled to him, pressing against his legs. But her fur was damp, her smell off, like she'd been lying in something that wasn't just water. He scooped her up, meaning to get out, now, before anything else. A noise came from the far side of the chamber. It was a dragging sound, slow, deliberate, just like on the porch. The shadows there were deeper than the rest, his light unable to reach the back wall. Something shifted inside them, tall enough that it had to hunch to fit beneath the low ceiling. Eli took a step back. The thing moved forward. Its outline was human, but its limbs were too long, its head tilting as though trying to see him from an angle. Its skin, or what he could see of it, was the same slick brown as the wet earth, and in places it seemed to merge with the wall itself. It spoke, not in words, but in that same slow, dragging rhythm as the scrape outside. A sound like something sharp drawn over stone. Eli ran. Eli didn't remember climbing the ladder. Only the feeling of the rungs slick under his hands and the weight of Daisy squirming in his arm as he shoved the trap door open. His phone beam swung wildly, catching the jar of teeth, the shredded coats, the gashes in the walls as he stumbled through the hall. Something was coming up the ladder behind him. He heard it, a wet sucking sound as its limbs pulled free of the tunnel walls. Wood groaned. The chain he'd broken clinked as it was dragged aside. The smell of earth and rot swelled until it filled the room. He didn't look back. The front door was still closed. He slammed into it, shoulder first, feeling the frame give. Outside, the forest was waiting again, silent, unmoving, but the mist had thickened, swirling low in pale coils that clung to the porch boards. Daisy whimpered, ears pinned. Eli ran. The deer trail was there, but wrong. Branches that hadn't been there before hung low, slick with dew, and the trunks seemed to lean toward him, their bark black and damp like the hut's interior walls. His boots sank into the soft ground, each step heavier than the last. Behind him, the door of the hut creaked open. He didn't hear footsteps. Not exactly, just the sound of something large moving through a narrow space, the subtle shudder of leaves, the soft thump of weight settling into soil. Eli picked up speed, lungs burning. The trail twisted in ways he didn't remember, curling back toward the creek when it should have led him away. Every landmark, the split oak, the leaning boulder, was gone, replaced with trees that seemed older, thicker, covered in hanging strings of not moss dot teeth, dozens of them, yellowed and pitted, dangling from red twine. They clicked, faintly as he passed, the sound following him like whispers. The air grew colder, heavy with the same sweetness from below the hut. Daisy began to squirm harder in his arm, nails digging into his jacket. Her eyes darted left, right, always over his shoulder. Almost out, he told her, though he didn't believe it. A shape moved between the trees ahead, tall, wrong in its angles. It stepped aside as he approached, disappearing behind a trunk thicker than a car. Another shape waited further on, and another, each only half seen, each just far enough away that his light never caught them fully. The forest was narrowing. The trunks closed in until he had to shoulder past them, bark scraping his arms, vines looped across the path, clinging wetly to his legs as if trying to hold him. Something touched the back of his neck, not a hand, colder, lighter, like a wet leaf. He jerked forward, heart hammering, and heard the faint tink of something hitting the ground, a tooth, fresh white. He broke through into a small clearing and stopped. The hut was there. He turned, but the trail he'd come from was gone. Only more trees, more teeth swaying from their branches. The hut's door hung wide now, a warm glow spilling out. Inside, he could see the table, the jar of teeth, the oil lamp, and someone sitting in the chair. They weren't moving, they weren't breathing, but their heads slowly turned toward him. Eli stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, Daisy trembling in his arm. The glow from the hut's oil lamp painted the doorway gold, but the light didn't reach far. It stopped just inside, like it didn't dare cross the threshold into the night. The figure in the chair sat with its back straight, hands resting in its lap. It might have been human, except the skin seemed stretched. The hair, what little there was, hung in thin, brittle strands, as if it had been soaked and dried too many times. Its head tilted slowly, not a natural movement, but a measured one, like the turning of a clock's hand. Eli's mind screamed at him to run, but his body stepped forward. The closer he came, the more the room's smell hit him. Earth's herbs rot, and the faint sweetness that had followed him since the... Daisy gave a low growl, not her usual bark, but a deep, warning rumble. The figure didn't blink. Its eyes were small, set to far back in shadow. The lamp's light revealed something in its lap, a bundle of the same red string that hung from the forest trees, and threaded onto it teeth, some human, some too large to be anything but animal. He stopped 2 steps inside. "Who are you?" His voice was hoarse. The head tilted the other way, just as slowly. "Where's the trail?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "How do I get out of here?" The figure's mouth opened. It didn't speak. It exhaled. The sound was dry, like wind over dead leaves. But beneath it came a smaller sound, almost hidden, a whimper. Daisy's ears shot up. Eli's stomach dropped. The sound was exactly like Daisy's bark. The figure closed its mouth again. Its hands began to move, slowly unwinding the red string from the bundle, letting the teeth slide into its lap one by one. They didn't clatter when they fell. They landed softly, as if the wood beneath them was padded. Eli stepped back, keeping his eyes on it. That was when he saw the wall behind the chair. It wasn't wood anymore. It was soil, damp, black soil, packed tight but bulging inward, threaded through with roots. And in that soil were shapes, faces, dozens of them, their features smoothed by time and dampness, but still recognizable as human. Their mouths were open, some in screams, some in something like laughter, and from each mouth hung a piece of red string. The figure in the chair leaned forward now, its joints creaking like old wood. The lamp's light spilled over its face at last. The skin wasn't stretched, it was stitched. Small, neat stitches, looping through skin that didn't match in tone or texture. A patchwork face, made from pieces. It raised one hand and pointed. At him, the soil wall shifted. Hands too many to count, pushed through from the inside, the fingers pale and dripping mud. They reached for him, pulling at the floorboards, the air at him. The smell surged, thick and choking. Eli bolted for the door. Behind him, the chair scraped hard against the floor, and something heavy began to move. Eli's boots hammered the porch planks. The clearing beyond was no longer silent. It whispered, not wind, not leaves, but dozens of voices layered over one another, murmuring in languages he didn't recognize, weaving into a low, rhythmic chant that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Daisy squirmed in his arm, claws snagging his jacket. Eyes locked on the tree line as if something was pacing him. Just out of sight, the forest was wrong again. The teeth strung from branches now swayed violently, though there was no wind. Some clicked against each other, others chattered as if gnashing. The red strings were no longer still, they curled and writhed, coiling round branches like worms. He ran for the trail. Every step forward seemed to take him farther from it. The trees closed in, and the mist thickened until he could barely see a foot ahead. Shapes moved within it, tall, thin, their faces smooth and blank except for deep holes where their mouths should be. The holes widened as he passed, the blackness inside them pulling at his vision, making his steps falter. A loud crack split the air. He spun. The hut was gone. In its place stood the door, just the door, freestanding in the mist. It was open, and behind it wasn't forest but blackness, shifting as if something inside were breathing. The chanting grew louder. He turned to run the other way, and found himself back. The walls of the hut were breathing. Eli could see them swell and contract, hear the faint stretch of damp wood and the groan of nails pulling free. The lamp on the table flickered violently, its light jerking across the symbols carved into the planks, and in that stuttered illumination, the grooves seemed fresh, wet, as though the knife had just been pulled away. The chair in the corner was empty. The patchwork figure was gone. Daisy writhed in his grip now, whining in short, panicked bursts, her gaze darting to the trapdoor. The chain he'd broken earlier was back in place, but this time it wasn't metal. It was the same red string from the forest, braided thick, the knots pulsing faintly like veins under skin. A thud from below. Then another, in a steady rhythm, not like the first knock he'd heard. This one was heavier. Closer, Eli backed toward the door, but the space between him and it stretched. Every step he took, the door seemed no nearer. The air thickened around his legs, cold and clinging, until he could barely lift his boots. The trapdoor snapped open. A hand shot out, long jointed wrong, skin slick and brown like the tunnel walls. It gripped the floorboards hard enough to splinter them. Another hand followed, then a head, stooping low, stitched from pieces that didn't match. Pale forehead, mottled jaw, eyes clouded white but moving with terrible focus. It pulled itself. Into the room, Eli bolted sideways, smashing into the table. The jar of teeth toppled, shattering, spilling its contents across the floor. But they didn't just scatter. Some of them rolled toward the trapdoor, as if drawn back to whatever had come from below. Others stopped, turned slowly, and faced him, and then they began to chatter. The figure came on all fours now, movements jerky but fast, its long limbs scraping over the boards. It didn't make a sound beyond the crack of its joints. No hiss, no growl, just the relentless click of its stitched-together hands. Pulling it forward, Eli dove for the front door. This time it was close enough to touch. He grabbed the handle, yanked, and opened it onto the underground tunnel. The wet air hit him first, then the smell, then the sound. Dripping water, slow and steady, and beneath it, breathing. Heavy, labored, not from one chest, but from many. The tunnel stretched in both directions, neither leading anywhere he could see. Daisy whimpered. The sound was echoed ahead of them, perfectly matched, but coming from deep in the dark. Behind him, the figure rose to its full height. Its head nearly brushed the ceiling, the stitches along its neck tugging as it tilted to watch him. Then it spoke in that slow, scraping rhythm, but this time the shapes in the sound began to form. Words, not yet. The soil walls around the tunnel began to ripple. Faces emerged, pushing through the dirt. Eyes wide, mouths open. Red strings dangled from their lips, the ends disappearing back into the earth. One by one, the mouths began to speak in unison. Stay. The ground under his feet softened. He sank to his knees, the mud sucking at him like a hand closing around his legs. The faces pushed closer, some only inches away now, their strings brushing against his skin. The figure stepped down into the tunnel, in the flicker of his dying phone light. Eli saw that its chest wasn't solid. It was a cage. And inside, more faces, smaller, pressed against the bone lattice, the strings in the forest. The jars, the teeth, it all fit now, and it was too late. The mud swallowed him to the waist. Daisy clawed at his shoulder, frantic, but the cold earth closed over them both. And the last thing Eli saw was the figure leaning down, stitched mouth, curling into something like a smile. Epilogue, the hut. After that dawn, the forest was quiet. The hut sat empty, door ajar. The oil lamp was cold, the table bare. No jars, no teeth, no sign anyone had been there in years, except for the string, red, frayed, tied to a low branch at the edge of the clearing. Threaded onto it was a single tooth, small white dot, and beside it, a yellow dog's tag with the name Daisy scratched into the metal.